Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Real American Revolution, a multimedia education program where we explore what really happened regarding individuals, events, issues before, during, and after America's War for Independence. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is John Sweeney, editor of Delaware's John Dickinson, the Constant Watchman of Liberty. John is a native of Philadelphia, a veteran of the United States Air Force, and a graduate of Temple University. A newspaper man by trade, John was editorial page editor of the News Journal in Wilmington, Delaware from 2005 to 2015. Prior to that, he was the paper's city editor, news editor, and public editor. So, John, welcome to the Real American Revolution.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you for inviting me.
John, you refer to John Dickinson as the most important founding father you never heard of. So let's talk about John Dickinson. First of all, how did you become interested in John Dickinson?
Well, as you mentioned, I was born in Philadelphia, and it took me a while to realize that I grew up about 4 or 5 subway stops away from Independence Hall. And when I was 10, the summer that I was 10, on July 4th, my father took me to Independence Hall for the ceremonies, and I just fell in love with the idea. I'm so old that in those days you could walk into the hall and the Liberty Bell was inside, and you could go up and touch the Liberty Bell and so forth. And that just, it gave me a thrill, and I had a lifelong interest in it. And it was a casual reader. I read about Jefferson and Washington and so forth. And when I came to Delaware as a newspaper editor, I started finding out about John Dickinson, and I kept thinking, this guy is fairly established and he was very important, but why hadn't I heard of him? And I started taking a closer look at him, and I became fascinated by his accomplishments, his personality, and how he helped other people. He was a great philanthropist, for example. And he's an amazing character. And of course, today, we as a public, we suffer from the public image of him brought to us, as we have mentioned in conversations, by the play 1776, the musical, and the John Adams HBO series. They, along with other people, they don't really do a very good job on portraying the true contribution and personality of John Dickinson.
Yeah. Why do you think that is, John? Why do you think that all of a sudden it seems to be an awful lot of editorializing on the part of Hollywood and others to try to deliberately paint him as a villain or someone as a foil of John Adams?
Well, it's John Adams' diaries and letters were first introduced by Herbert Butterfield, I believe, the historian. Starting in the 50s and 60s, they started to publish the uncensored version of John Adams' diaries. They're extremely colorful letters and diary entries. The great historian Gordon Wood said that John Adams would have made a great 18th century novelist. His formal writings are very stiff and hard to read for modern readers. But his letters and his letters to Abigail, for example, and to his friends back in Boston are filled with gossip and his opinions. As I said in the introduction to the book of Delaware's John Dickinson, Wood only had it half right. He not only would have made a great 18th century novelist, he was a novelist. He was an 18th century novelist. He made up a lot of stuff about different people. You know, Dickinson was or Adams was known for his dislike of certain people. A lot of things he said about Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, even George Washington, and so forth. Much of it turns out not to be true, and there are some incidents of John Dickinson's life that are described by John Adams, which have become holy writ among historians and are repeated over and over again, that just simply aren't true or probably could not have happened. And also, I think one of the big things against Dickinson in his terms of reputation throughout history is when it came to that final moment of voting for independence on July 2nd in 1776, he didn't vote for it. He didn't vote against it. He and Robert Morris thought it was too soon. They thought independence was coming and it was inevitable, but they thought it was too soon. We didn't have a frame of government at that point. We did not have allies. So both of them, in order to allow the Pennsylvania delegation to vote no, they stayed away that day from the Congress. So they thought, Dickinson later said he thought it would be very important that it be a unanimous vote. And if he had stayed there, he couldn't bring himself to vote yes, it would not be a unanimous vote. So he left.
Interesting.
And another thing is, after the government he did a great job, played a very important role of constitutional convention, but he did not run for federal office, and he was not part of the federal government, the new federal government.
Right.
He didn't quite retire, but he stayed out of the national spotlight after that.
Interesting. Well, this volume, Delaware's John Dickinson, is a fabulous collection of essays by authors and historians and scholars and elected officials. How did you manage to pull all these individuals together to share their insights and stories about John Dickinson's life? How did this whole project get started?
Well, it's partially by accident. Judge Battle Robinson, retired judge in Delaware, was president of the Friends of John Dickinson Mansion at the time, several years ago. And she came across, stuck in a drawer in the attic, a bunch of old and beginning to fall apart papers that were speeches and essays written by historians and prominent Delaware U.S. senators and governors and so forth in appreciation of John Dickinson. The Friends of John Dickinson Mansion had formed very early in the 50s, along with the Daughters of the American Revolution. They helped preserve his mansion. And so they, trying to raise money and to keep the memory of Dickinson alive, they sponsored a series of speeches and talks by prominent historians, experts on John Dickinson and so forth. They did other things too. For example, in the 20th century, there was no biography of Dickinson. So they sponsored a biography written by Milton Flower. That is the most prominent biography of Dickinson to this day. It was the Friends of John Dickinson Mansion who brought that about. Well, anyway, Judge Robinson went to the Dick Carter at the Delaware Heritage Commission and said, "Do you know anybody who could edit these pieces into a pamphlet?" And he said, "Well, John Sweeney just retired from the News Journal. He's interested in Dickinson." And so that's how the story began, and it became fascinating. There were the insights of some of these people. My favorite is Howard Rubendale, who was late president of Dickinson College, who told this story, which I think is hilarious, of how Benjamin Rush created Dickinson College and tried to name it the John and Mary's College, just like William and Mary's College in Virginia. But Dickinson would have no part of it, right? And Dickinson said, "This is too much. I don't want to be involved in it." And they went back and forth, and it's something of a comedy of the relationship between Rush and Dickinson. And Mr. Rush was quite volatile. He liked you one minute, he didn't like you the next, and you were the greatest person in the world, then you were an enemy to society. So it went back and forth. Well, Rubendale had this extended anecdote in his essay, and my job as an editor was to cut that down, to present it so that you could understand it. So I think it was a great find, and Battle Robinson deserves a lot of credit for it. And Dick Carter designed the book, and I think it's a beautiful book. And he pulled together a lot of portraits and pictures of the mansion. Right. So that's how it came about.
Well, heretofore, it really is the most complete picture by a number of people of John Dickinson. And of course, our mutual friend Jane Calvert is working on the writings, and that'll be a fabulous project when that's completed as well. And I note that Jane also has a couple essays in there as well.
Yes, she is. The Friends had brought her in several times. The Friends also raised money to help support the John Dickinson writing project that Jane is directing and doing such a great job for, and helped her get started with that.
It's terrific. Well, John, finally, why should Americans be interested in John Dickinson today? He's not very well known. For those of us who have read and studied and researched about some of his past and the contributions that he made, he means something to America for us, and is truly a genuine founding father. But what should Americans know about him at the very least today? What's the takeaway from understanding who John Dickinson was, and why is he so important?
I think we should realize that he was at many of the most important formation events in our history as we move toward independence and the creation of the United States government. He was not just there, but he played an important part. He helped shape the intellectual background of it, but he also inspired a lot of people. His writings, the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, were very influential on James Madison. James Madison was a young man when he read them, and they helped formulate Madison's political thoughts. Dickinson also was way ahead of his time in many ways. He was one of the first people to write and to include in his proposed Articles of Confederation about freedom of the press and freedom of religion. It didn't make it to the final version, but he was a constant advocate for religion. He battled Benjamin Franklin very early in his political career over whether Pennsylvania should become a royal colony or not, because he was afraid that if it became a royal colony, the old William Penn's old charter of 1701 would disappear, and that guaranteed freedom of religion for all people, not just the Quakers living in Pennsylvania. And Dickinson said, this is our greatest heritage from William Penn. If we lose it, we'll be so much poorer. And then later he argued for freedom of the press. He wrote a beautiful letter to the citizens of Quebec in 1774, which he outlined what they were missing if they stayed with the British government. And he basically gave them and offered them a Bill of Rights, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, trial by jury, that they would be able to elect their own officials and so forth. And he laid it out over and over again. And he was at the Constitutional Convention. He practically invented the US Senate. And very early in the proceedings, he told James Madison and the other delegates at the convention that you're going to have to compromise. This was like just a few days after Madison introduced Madison's group introduced the Virginia plan. He said that you're going to have to compromise. You're going to have two houses. One will be based on population and one will be based on something else, because the smaller states won't do it. Then, lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, William Patterson in New Jersey came in with the New Jersey plan, which almost wrecked the whole convention. And again, so they came back, and he played an important part under the radar, pulling that together with the compromise. He also, for us today, I think it's very important what he said during that debate, that he said that experience must be our only guide because reason may mislead us. And by that, he said, we already have the states, for example. Why should we try to invent something else? The states are here. They can be proper units to form local governments. Let's use that. He said the jury system wasn't invented by somebody sitting in a room by himself, said, hey, I have an idea. Let's create something called the jury system. It came about over time. He said, so let's go by what our experience is and not go dreaming up something else. Let's make sure it works first. So his tolerance, and also I must add that he freed the slaves that he owned. He came to the conclusion that slavery was wrong. It will be very interesting to see what Jane Calvert and her crew produce on the letters that are hard to find now, explaining his change of heart to mark his journey, saying that if God wants me to be happy, he wants all people to be happy. And that includes Africans who are enslaved. So he became an abolitionist. He fought for to the end of slavery in Delaware, and he leaves a good legacy. He was a man of his time. He wasn't a 21st century progressive or conservative or something like that. He certainly was a man of his time, but quite admirable qualities.
That's remarkable. Well, John Sweeney, editor of Delaware's John Dickinson, the Constant Watchman of Liberty, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
Randy, thank you for inviting me.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for viewing or listening to this edition of The Real American Revolution. My name is Randy Flood. Join us again next time for another exciting interview as we discuss the real American Revolution. So long for now. I'm going to keep this running for a little bit so we can chat about some insights or so, and we might be able to even splice those into future commentaries about John Dickinson, because I think it's important that, the broader that we can, cast the net, and the more people we can talk to and provide insights about Dickinson, the greater possibility of raising his profile. I'd like you to talk a little bit about how he was chosen to be the chairman of the Annapolis Convention. Things were not working out with the Articles of Confederation, and lo and behold, John Dickinson, who opposes the Declaration of Independence, is the chairman to try to get everybody out of the quagmire that became the Articles of Confederation, a watered down version, I might add, of what we both know to be a stronger constitution, which he initially chose. And now all of a sudden they come back to him. Was it because he wrote that stronger version that they sought his leadership?
One of the things we have to realize that there were certain people who were more highly thought of at the time by their contemporaries than they are today, both by the public and by historians. John Jay is one of them. John Jay was, he had a great influence, but we're not that familiar with it. Robert Morris is another one, the financier, but his insights into how the political system would work and how the financial system would work were very influential. We don't appreciate that today. And Dickinson would be the third person, starting with his writings at the Stamp Act Congress, where he pulled together all of the thoughts and his ideas went out. In 1865, he sat down, he showed that he had a good pen that could take the collective thoughts of everyone and sum it up and get it out. Then, of course, the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania was extremely influential. It was the most influential series of letters or pamphlets throughout that period, except for Thomas Paine's Common Sense. He also wrote a number of other pieces that are pretty much forgotten today because we got to independence, and he was writing about the rights of Americans. He's the first person, this was in the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, to refer to those of us living on the North American continent as the American people. No one had said that before. No one thought of the people in Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, and so forth as American people. The American people, they were Virginians and so forth. They were Britons living on this continent. They were colonists, and he said they're people. And he laid that out. And then during the Continental Congress, he wrote a number of pieces that helped pull together the thinking at the time. In 1775, he did something that was extraordinary, that he wrote two pieces. It was in July of 1775, a year before the Declaration of Independence. There was a summary of, I always get this title wrong, but a summary of the outrages committed against the Americans, and it was aimed at the American people. Jefferson wrote the first version of it, and Congress did not think that was strong enough. And then they gave it to Dickinson, as they always did, to rewrite it. He put some language in it that Jefferson was later able to say, and did say, that he watered it down. He was too weak, you know. But in reality, he didn't. Dickinson didn't. He toughened it up. He has a great line. He says, "Our cause is right. We are ready, and we will fight." So Dickinson's thinking was two-fisted. One, let's fight. Then he also wrote the olive branch petition, which he saw as a prayer. In fact, he said in a letter to someone, it was a prayer. He says, look, if we just say we're going to go to war and then they turn around and say, no, let's have peace, what are we going to do? And so he also wrote the olive branch paper, olive branch petition, that John Adams hated so much. So it was extraordinary, but it had the olive branch petition was later condemned by Adams. And as I made reference to his diaries and his letters, he kept saying this was the weak-kneed, timid, cowardly John Dickinson. But in reality, it was very popular. Members of Congress wanted it. There were a lot of people who were for it at the time. And then during the Constitution, he later, when he came back after he disappeared after the Declaration, he became governor's Delaware. Then he became governor of Pennsylvania. And for a while, for about 6 or 7 months, he was governor of both states. And so his reputation was quite high. To get back to your question about Annapolis, he was a prominent figure. Now, if you think that they just hated him for not signing the Declaration, remember he carried a gun at the Battle of, he carried a musket at the Battle of the Brandywine, and he was willing to put his life on the line. He didn't see any action, but he was inducted into the Society of the Cincinnati. His contemporaries were willing to induct him into that. So he was quite well respected at the time. And then, of course, it was very important. He had a very important role as a mediator and as someone pulling people together, and also to articulating a lot of the viewpoints, especially of the smaller states. In the Constitutional Convention. And then afterwards, he wrote a series of essays that are very interesting. The Letters of Fabius. They're not as important or as good, if you will, as the Federalist, but they make some very good points about our ideas in society. He talks about something called the contributed rights, that when we come in as a society, we are born, God gives us a whole set of rights. And like I have a right to do whatever I want, eat whatever I want, and so forth. Well, if I'm going to live in a society, I can't do that, right? That doesn't make sense. So I have to contribute that right to society. I agree to not beat up my enemies for peace, general peace. So he breaks that down. But he said that there are other rights, like my freedom of thought, my freedom of religion, and so forth, that no, I can't give those away. They have to remain with me. So they had some influence at the time, the Fabius letters. Washington was greatly impressed about them. He didn't know who the author was, but he wrote people saying, this is a very good argument. I hope people.
I understand they were also a little bit more widespread, where Dickinson was looking at all the colonies and Americans in general. You know, the Federalist Papers, which have been identified in history books today as the sales package to the state legislature was really targeting the New York legislature, where Hamilton had so much problem in trying to get New York aboard.
Right.
And of course, Jay from New York likewise was involved. And of course, Madison was brought in as well. But they seemed to get the most play in terms of the document that sold the Constitution, when in fact Dickinson's papers under the name Fabius really were much more widespread. And as I understand it, the research that I've learned developed is that they're not only more widespread, but they were better known at the time than the Federalist Papers.
Yes, we have to keep in mind that the Federalist Papers came in fairly late in that whole process of ratification. A number of states had already voted to ratify the Constitution before the first Federalist paper was printed. And then the circulation of the Federalist Papers, which was far more limited. They didn't get to Virginia until just before, I think only one or two of them got to Virginia until just before Virginia voted on the ratification. So yes, the Federalist Papers' reputation is probably post-Constitution, post-ratification,
right.
Because it's a wonderful piece of political philosophy. And, you can spend a lot of time looking at that, studying it, and then looking at what we have today, and you can learn a lot. But I think that Dickinson's Fabius letters are worth that too.
Interesting. There's a number of things that I wanted to ask you. I wanted to refer back to the John Adams relationship. As I understand it, John Adams was, I'll use the word giddy, with meeting John Dickinson when he first came to Philadelphia, and apparently wrote some letters to Abigail about meeting the great John Dickinson. And so it appears at one point, at least during the early stage of their professional relationship as delegates representing various constituencies, Adams appeared to have a lot of admiration and respect for Dickinson, of what he had heard about Dickinson before he met him. And then as the story evolves with the modern popular culture, that's not even mentioned, that they're friends or that Adams respects Dickinson at the outset. It's like they almost meet the first time and they are in loggerheads. So can you shed a little light on the dramatic turnabout about how Adams writes to Abigail and says, this John Dickinson is, I'm delighted to meet him, that type of thing. And then all of a sudden, later on in his memoirs,
it wasn't all of a sudden. You
Yeah.
have to realize that they met over a couple of years, and Adams' turn against Dickinson took time. It wasn't until 1775. Now, in defense of Adams, something I don't do very often, but I'll defend him here, is that the people in Boston experienced the British occupation. It was a much more real threat to them. There was the Battle of Bunker Hill. Abigail could hear the cannon from her porch. It was a much more real problem and that was facing them. They were feeling the fever for independence was much stronger in New England than it was in the middle colonies. And much stronger than it was in the South. Dickinson played a part in the subtle change within the Continental Congress, starting in 74. He joined the Congress, this first Congress, at the end, because his old enemy, Joseph Galloway, wouldn't let him, he handpicked who would be Pennsylvania's representatives. And it wasn't until the Assembly forced Galloway toward the end of the first Congress to admit that Dickinson came. So he missed the early part of that, but he was doing things behind the scenes. He was actually rewriting different papers that were submitted by others and so forth. But he played a part that was something that was developing. The Americans believed that Parliament, at the very beginning of this argument, that Parliament was overstepping its bounds. And slowly they came to think that Parliament really didn't have any control. Not only could they not raise taxes, eventually they got to the point they can't do anything. You can't tell us anything because of, despite what the English say, there's no virtual representation. We have the rights of Englishmen, therefore we should be represented in a parliament, but we're not represented in that parliament, so you can't not only raise our taxes, you can't make laws for us. And that's an evolutionary thought, and Dickinson played a part of it. The one thing that would keep them together, and this is appealed to the moderates, is the fact we have the same king. So eventually things went to the king. Parliament they were beginning to ignore Parliament whatsoever. We don't care what Parliament says, but we respect the king. Thus you have the petitions to the king. And thus in 1776, Jefferson writes in the Declaration of Independence, it's not against Parliament, it's against the king. They're cutting that final string. And John Adams did not want, didn't want to go through that step. He wanted to skip it. And that's where he starts in early 1775 when they reconvene. He starts going against Dickinson because Dickinson is saying we are still faithful subjects of the king. And other moderates were doing that. Now remember that in 1776, the Western counties in Pennsylvania wanted to have greater representation. So there was an election on May 1st, 1776. And John Adams and Samuel Adams and a group of radicals in Philadelphia, including Thomas Paine, went all out to take over the Pennsylvania Assembly and thus get rid of Dickinson, right? Well, Dickinson's forces won the election. The people thought, who was representing the people? Dickinson won, but then things started changing. And then, of course, there was the Pennsylvania government was overthrown, and then by the end of June, and Dickinson and several other members were out. And then Dickinson went off to fight the war in New Jersey and so forth. So it's a long, interesting combination. But Adams, I think it's very interesting about the play and the movie or the TV movie about Adams is Samuel Adams doesn't play a big part. He's not even mentioned in the musical 1776.
Right.
Barry Wills in his book, Inventing America, notes that, and he says somehow he thinks that Samuel Adams would have liked that. During the first year or so, John, until they move forward to openly arguing for independence and greater criticism of them, John Adams was playing messenger boy for Samuel Adams. It was Samuel Adams who was doing things, pulling the strings and working with Richard Henry Lee of Virginia and working with other would-be radicals. Thomas McCain of Delaware, who was a very good friend of John Dickinson, helped get him booted. So I think it's a fascinating story, and the more I read about it, it becomes even more fascinating.
Yeah. One of the things that also intrigues me about in doing research about the American Revolution is there's never any mention of smuggling. And and only recently in a three-part series called The Sons of Liberty, where they were focusing on Samuel Adams and a little bit of Dr. Joseph Warren, and of course John Hancock being drawn in. Those three primary characters were featured in that series. And in one instance, they're standing in a warehouse trying to figure out what to do against the British, and you see these people behind them carrying these huge boxes of basically contraband wine and stacking them in the warehouse. And people don't realize that in Boston, before the French and Indian War, before the debts began to mount up after the war, all the colonies, but Massachusetts in particular, had a very thriving smuggling business. the Navigation Acts prevented all the colonies from trading directly with Spain or France or the Dutch Republic or anywhere. Everything had to be shipped on British ships, crewed by British crews. And of course, prices were set by the British government and so forth. And so smuggling was a major integral part of the colonial economy in America.
It was, even in
You know?
Pennsylvania, and you had a lot of the Quaker merchants who later pulled back from going to war with Britain, or were very reluctant, or declared neutrality, were very profitable smugglers. And there was no disgrace to it in local society. The British officials were bribed to a great extent. They knew what was going on. The merchants knew what was going on, and on and on. So yeah, you're right. It should become apparent. This is what it sort of accentuates the idea of why they hated taxes, because they didn't want, not only especially when with the tea tax, they were going to lower the tax.
Yeah.
Say, see, this is a great deal, so you'll buy more. And I said, well, we're not paying any taxes at all.
Well, it was a bold move, I think, of the British to undercut the smuggling. That's what the tea tax was. I mean, they were offering quality tea at rock bottom prices. And if you're a smuggler, you can only go so low on the black market to be able to gain a profit. And if the government comes in and subsidizes, in essence, surplus tea that they want to get rid of at quality tea at rock bottom prices, that puts you as a smuggler out of business. So
Yes.
I think I'd probably throw that tea overboard too. And
Yeah,
but that's not what the story is. The story in the history books is we paid a tax on tea.
Yeah, you have the people who are against the taxation, because that was a real idea that they were really thinking of. And then you also had the people who had a financial stake in the matter.
Right.
But if you turn around and you take a look at it, the Lord North's salvation of the East India Company was really something like too big to fail.
Oh, absolutely.
There were quite a few members of Parliament who owned stock in the East India Company. So they did not want to lose money and lose their markets. So I'm sure North thought it was a win-win situation. Little did he know.
Yes, I know. Absolutely. Well, Joanne Freeman calls these after presentation things, like after dinner conversations, where they get into some of the meat of the issues and everything. And I sure have enjoyed this, because I wanted to talk to you and get your thoughts on that as well. And obviously, sometimes for production purposes, you have to kind of cut and splice, and certainly pull together shorter interviews. But in any event, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, and I'd like to do it again sometime when we have a chance to chat, and particularly when Jane, as she continues to produce her writings of Dickinson, that'll provide an opportunity. Maybe I can have all three of us do an interview or something at some point. The more we can promote Dickinson and the real person that he is, and have Americans understand and appreciate him, I think the better for all of us as we move forward the 250th anniversary.
That's right. Can I hit you with an irony about Dickinson? Sure. Dickinson declined to sign the Declaration. If he had signed it, I believe he would have went to the Constitutional Convention as a representative of Pennsylvania, because he was one of the most popular politicians in Pennsylvania. They later, he was later selected as governor because they had so much respect for him. But if he had signed it, he would have gone to the convention, the Constitutional Convention, as a representative of Pennsylvania. And he would not then have had the chance or the opportunity or the need to conspire with George Read about fighting off the bigger states. He would have been arguing on behalf of the bigger states. So my question is, would Delaware exist today as a state
Well, that's a
Because that
very
was what a
interesting
lot of
point.
people were talking about. Even people in Pennsylvania said, there's no reason for Delaware to exist. There's no reason for the smaller states to exist, and
Now, there's something to
so
be said for Delaware to be the first state to ratify the
yeah,
Constitution.
they were very yeah, they were very eager to do it. But also about the signing of the Declaration. Robert Morris boycotted or stayed away from the actual vote. He did the same thing that Dickinson did, but he came back. Dickinson was offered the opportunity to sign it, and he said, no, that would be hypocritical. I'm not going to sign it.
Right.
And he said, I know that this will do me in. Morris signed it. Nobody remembers that he didn't vote, that he boycotted. I'll give you something even wilder. George Reed voted against it. He actually voted against it. Dickinson didn't vote against it. Morris didn't vote against it. Reed voted against it, but he stayed, and then he signed it. So in Delaware, nobody knows that he voted against independence. We tell the story about Caesar Rodney and his ride,
Right,
and so
right.
forth, and it was split 2-1 or 1-1. McCain and Reed, but they don't follow that through. This is, wait a minute, Reed was voting against it because he voted against independence. He was doing whatever Dickinson did. He believed in it, but he didn't stay away. Because he was afraid that if he left, then it would have been up to McCain, who would have voted, he would have voted yes, and so forth. So George Reed gets a free pass in all this.
Well, also the musical 1776 provides a huge disservice to Dickinson and other characters, among which would be Dr. James Wilson. It would have you believe in the musical that it's Ben Franklin, Dr. Wilson, and John Dickinson representing Pennsylvania. There's no mention of Delaware, of course, and then except for the fact that Caesar Rodney is technically representing the Delaware delegation. And, of course, he rides back to cast the vote, but his health is failing when he initially leaves. But James Wilson was an outstanding Supreme Court justice and brilliant lawyer. And yet he's painted to be a stooge in the ping pong between Dickinson and Franklin, in the debate.
Yes, and of course, he played such an important role in the Constitutional Convention. He played a great part in the Electoral College, which may get him in trouble today, but also in the powers of the president. If you look at that, Wilson's thinking was very important. Now, remember, he's the first person in the Constitutional Convention who used the phrase "we the people," and he was saying, his big solution. They kept saying, "Where's the sovereignty?" This is we can't say, are the states the sovereign? The king's not the sovereign. Who's the sovereign? And he says, the people are. We the people are the sovereign.
Yeah.
And then everybody goes, boing, they start thinking that.
Yes.
Yeah, McCain, there are a number of people. Samuel Hopkins of Rhode Island is made out to be a drunk. He was a brilliant scholar.
Yeah.
And very important, very good Democrat. He had been governor of Rhode Island several times, and an eloquent man, gave some great speeches and so forth.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll have an opportunity to not necessarily rewrite history, but to correct it. And as Ray Raphael likes to say, do something about the founding myths, that the stories that hide our patriotic past. So, anything that we can move in that direction, I think is a commendable effort. So, John, I want to thank you again for taking time in this after conversation here to catch up. So I'll pause, or I'll stop our recording, and then we can sign off. Okay.
All righty.